I'm excited to welcome Andrew Gray. He's a highly credentialed human performance specialist with over 2 decades of successful experience in professional sport and consulting. Andrew specializes in integration of sports medicine, sports science, and strength and conditioning, as well as innovative use of new technologies to progress human performance practices. Currently, high performance manager at the West Tigers in the National Rugby League in Australia, as well as the director of athletic data innovations, which is a software company that bridges the gap between tracking technologies and the end user. Andrew also consults with iMeasureU as an IMU applied expert. He also consults across multiple international sports codes within businesses as well as defense. So he's a strong believer in creating high performance environments that enable individuals to maximize their potential. Andrew also enjoys a good mountain or ocean adventure with his wife and 2 children. So I'll go ahead and end that poll now and hand it over to Andrew so you can take it away. Andrew, are you able to see that poll when I share it?
Great. Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Hopefully I can pass on to everybody some of the things I've learned over the last few years, and also through my use of inertial sensors. So, in the last 20 years in pro sports, moving through roles in physiotherapy, strength and conditioning, sports science, and onto high performance management, I've seen many changes. Technology used to support decision making has now become embedded in the high performance sport environment, which has really happened in the last 10 to 15 years. And tech has also played a significant role in my career to date. So, always an early adopter. I have a keen interest in new technology as long as it satisfies a few key rules, which I'll discuss shortly. I began using athlete tracking devices, GPS at the time, perhaps 15 years ago, and was immediately hooked by what I thought was possible, but also frustrated by the superficiality of the metrics at the time. So my immediate interest was in measuring as much of the movement spectrum as possible. And as opportunity arose, I developed and operated Athletic Data Innovations, or ADI, originally an analytics software consultancy used by some of the world's largest football teams across multiple codes. My thought processes were, if I could focus on capturing changes of velocity, I may be able to measure mechanical work, thereby gain a better understanding of game demands and improve my own team's preparation. Additionally, if I could utilize the inertial sensor embedded within the GPS devices to capture the foot strike and then integrate these findings with the GPS sensor, I'd have a really powerful way of advancing the understanding of the return to play process. And that's where I was coming from with the whole endeavor. As a result, I began to extract raw data from the devices, build my own metric templates, and see what I could measure from the GPS device when athletes change velocity, that is speed or trajectory, one or the other, or both, and from the inertial sensor when an athlete's foot made contact with the ground. So ADI was born from that curiosity, and it seems that some of the world's biggest teams had a similar vision as they quickly got on board. It was Chelsea FC, Real Madrid, PSG, AS Roma, Rugby Federations, England Rugby, Ireland Rugby, and the Wallabies, ADI's first client, all among ADI's customers, and have made so many significant contributions to its development so far. So today, I'm really pleased, excited to be presenting on behalf of iMeasureU. As James said, I deeply believe in the direction Vicon and iMeasureU are taking with their mix of technology and the potential for huge advances in athlete preparation that are becoming possible. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll provide some practical examples of using IMU-Step to modify rehabilitation outcomes. I'll outline my main rehabilitation considerations, cover the important data collection systems that I consider to be best practice, attempt to provide clarity to the issue of calculating asymmetry, and then move through a real-world case study with a pro athlete whilst walking through some of my thought processes during the decision-making process along the way. So firstly, here are some of the key points I consider when approaching rehabilitation of athletes. Progressively loading healing tissue as recovery allows. That makes sense. It's a complex issue requiring a good understanding of physiological healing and solid physical assessment skills. Ensuring that the rehabilitation process is preparing your athlete for competition demands and mitigating the risk of injury recurrence. Which physical qualities does my athlete most need to exhibit when they return? What do they need to be able to do to recommence training with the team? How does that differ from returning to competition? What are the positional differences of each environment? They're the sort of questions that need to be considered looking at a long-term rehabilitation. I believe it's important to view injury as an opportunity to improve in other areas. In the increasingly busy schedule of professional athletes, rehabilitation periods present a chance to hone in on previously under-addressed problems, such as strength or mobility deficits, technical deficiencies, or even mindset and leadership abilities. The mindset needs to be returning a better athlete, a more complete package. So psychological repair following significant injury is also of vital importance, and long-term rehabilitation should be filled with small wins, in my opinion, in various areas. The process of goal setting, achieving, and moving on is a powerful cycle, and it's integral to becoming performance ready once again. I've found that technology can play an influential role in the rehabilitation process. Before data provided insight into the movement demands of a particular sport or activity, we relied on experienced eyes to explain to us the finer details of what was required to excel at a physical endeavour. Whilst the explosion of technology and data have put numbers alongside the movement, it still is my opinion that an experienced practitioner visualising movement remains a vital piece of the puzzle to provide context to movement analytics, and I believe that this will continue to be relevant for some time to come. We must be mindful of not becoming solely reliant on our data, or we'll lose our coach's eye. And I found that the key to successfully integrating and embedding new technologies is to first understand their limitations, then develop strong systems for their consistent application, simplify their output measures, and create a common language around their results and interpretation that spreads through the organisation, players and staff. Now, whilst my consultancy roles have been with some well-resourced clubs and federations, my team roles in Australia have generally been in financial environments where every spend must be well targeted and justified. Every new acquisition thoroughly investigated prior to inclusion into a program. As such, to have success in these environments, new technology must also satisfy these three objectives. They must accurately measure what they set out to measure. Secondly, they must tangibly add value to a high-performing environment and provide an opportunity for the user to investigate and innovate with access to high-quality raw data. That's really important, in my opinion. Thirdly, any technology addition to the performance program must fit the resourcing model from a cost and personnel perspective for that environment. The last point is now increasingly important as the sporting landscape continues to evolve in a post-COVID economic landscape. Ultimately, the goal of integrating technology such as IMU-Step into the rehabilitation of lower limb injury is being able to engage and connect your athlete to your plan emotionally, because in my experience, this is where the best results occur. Having good data management systems in place will ensure that all processes are carried out consistently, efficiently, and to a high standard. It's vital within a high-performing environment to manage the time you are spending on a particular process and to ensure that staff are using their time effectively and that all relevant tasks are being performed as required. This is a huge challenge day to day. So now I'll discuss a few of my key points for success in this area. Device application systems. So much of this will seem like common sense to many of you, but having a good system that controls when, how, and why devices are applied to athletes is very important. We're all human. We get preoccupied. We'd rather be talking about what happened the other day or what we think about so-and-so. So I'm a firm believer that if a system is failing, look at the system first, not the individuals. As athletes move through their day, ideally there are no opportunities to deviate from what needs to be done. Athletes should pour through a facility like water along a stream, where at certain points, staff should, build virtual dams across this stream to halt the flow of the athletes and remove any opportunities for non-compliance. Poorly developed systems, in my experience, will waste your time and stop you from doing the things that lead to better outcomes with your athletes. So, my advice in that area would be take time to build your systems and educate everyone involved on how and why technology is being used. Footnoting systems. So in IMU-Step, portioning or separating of activity is termed footnoting. After years of collecting data on athletes and often wishing I'd captured more detail at the time, one of the most important processes within a data management system is recording adequate detail about the activity at the time of capture, as this really determines the degree of insight possible during analysis later on, which I'll show you in detail. Right from the start, you want to be able to separate your training activities in order to gain a better understanding of how each activity challenges your athlete. What are the peak step impacts during that activity? How symmetrical is my athlete whilst performing this activity? What does this activity contribute to the overall load of the session? How does this information relate to the symptoms that my athlete has reported? So IMU-Step manages these footnotes easily from a phone or iPad in seconds, or post-activity in the desktop platform. Activity suitability and session flow are vital considerations for optimal rehabilitation. So having information on individual session portions is integral to good planning. The wrong activity at the wrong time can lead to setbacks for your athlete that negatively affect their return to play timeframes and their trust in your process. I'll outline footloading structure, the one that I use, within the case study section of the webinar. Baselining practices. So baseline data is important in any scientific process because it allows comparison between data from before and after any intervention or event, such as an injury. With this in mind, capturing IMU-Step data from healthy athletes is of vital importance, as it provides a baseline to compare to following injury. As practitioners, I think it's our responsibility to have a deep understanding of the physical requirements of competition in our sport, or the match demands. It's equally important to be able to relate this to different positions within a team in order to be able to have confidence that your athlete's ready to progress and return to the field of play. Match data or sport-specific drills or tests make the most sense at baseline captures. Pre-season periods and rehabilitation intervals often provide the best opportunity to capture data on demand-specific activities. So in my practice, I select fitness tests, standard agility drills, plyometric movements, high-speed runs, as well as entire training sessions that are representative of the average for the team and baseline healthy athletes during the pre-season period. In this way, I've got good data to refer to should that athlete suffer an injury during the competition season. Now, the measurement of asymmetry is a hot topic. It's open to a vast array of interpretations. I guess intuitively, we know that symmetrical performance of symmetrical activities, such as the human gait, is more efficient and likely more resilient against injury. From close analysis of ourselves, however, and the athletes we serve, we also know that there exists asymmetry in us all. We also know that the human body is an amazing adapter, but that this adaptation takes time. When change happens too quickly, things can go wrong. So over the years, here's what I've learned about asymmetry. Athletes alter their loading pattern in response to pain, restriction, or fatigue. Changes in running symmetry occur following injury. Loading patterns do not always reset once injuries seem to have resolved and an athlete is returned to the field of play. Long-term running asymmetry places chronic strain on the musculoskeletal system, which undoubtedly leads to compensatory changes. Professional athletes are nearly always recovering from minor complaints, and athletes are not always motivated to report minor changes in the way they feel for countless reasons. With systems like IMU-Step, we can capture data about running symmetry in a non-invasive way during routine training. This data can be acted upon to mitigate the chance of injury. Now, additionally, globally speaking, injuries significantly and negatively affect performance of individuals and teams, and lower injury rates improve a team's chance of success. So asymmetry data also has a central place in assessing and progressing a rehabilitation program, which I'll discuss later with some examples. Perhaps the reason that measurement of asymmetry remains a grey area in our field is due to the fact that asymmetry metrics are affected by so many different factors. The asymmetry measure will vary considerably depending on the device, the location of that device, or the means of calculating the measure. So we're still searching for answers about how much asymmetry is relevant, and this is a complex issue. From my first-hand experience, I believe it should be chronic running asymmetry that in part guides our corrective exercise prescription, and the short-term changes in running symmetry that informs how we react on a day-to-day basis. This is the framework that I've used. So inertial sensors, or IMUs, are small, light, sensitive to small changes in movement. They're capable of capturing g-forces and rotations at very high rates from various locations on any individual. IMUs have classically been mounted on the thoracic spine, embedded within GPS tracking devices, at or near the center of gravity, or in more peripheral locations on the extremities. IMUs placed in different locations will record the same activity in different ways. This is important to understand. We must remember that what we are measuring is the acceleration and rotation at the level of the device, not the ground reaction force or the movement of entire body segments or the body as a whole. If the step impact is what we are most interested in measuring, it makes sense that the closer the device is located to that impact, the better the recorded data will be. In my experience, it appears that varying levels of force dissipation occur when step impacts are recorded by devices located away from the location of the impact. It also seems intuitive, I guess, that changes in limb length, joint mobility, and varying gait strategies will significantly alter results. There are many different ways to measure asymmetry within a movement, like the human gait. We must consider where the sensor was placed. What type of sensor was it? Which axis of the data did we decide to rely on? Consistency here is key. So asymmetry measures will also vary considerably based on our metric rationale. Are we interested in the symmetry of overall load between right and left limbs? Or are we more interested in symmetry between average left step impact and average right step impact, irrespective of how many left or right steps there were? Think about that for the moment. Dependent on the context of our analysis, we may be interested in either or both. So, to make sense of that, in my opinion, we should consider if we are interested in the absolute asymmetry or the relative asymmetry. IMU-Step provides a user with both metrics, and we'll discuss both of these in a later section. The specific way in which asymmetry is calculated between left and right sides adds further variability to results, adding even greater complexity. As I discussed earlier, simplifying output measures and creating a common language amongst all stakeholders is central to bringing context to the interpretation of any metric. So not only must we consider whether we're interested in absolute or relative asymmetry, we must also decide if we're interested in left compared to right, right compared to left compared to the average of both, or something different entirely. So IMU have simplified this in an upcoming release of IMU-Step and have chosen something that is easy to understand, the difference divided by the sum. So using this calculation for both absolute and relative terms, if we imagine 11 units, let's say 11G on the left and 9G on the right, that will yield an asymmetry of 11 minus 9 being the difference, which equals 2, divided by 11 plus 9, or 20. So 2 divided by 20, giving us an asymmetry of 10% left. The calculation is identical for absolute and relative asymmetry, only the inputs will change, whether we're looking at the overall load between each limb or the average impact symmetry between each limb. If we're inputting impact load, we're looking at absolute symmetry, the absolute difference in load between left and right sides. If we are inputting average impact intensity, the average left step peak compared to the average right step peak, we're looking at relative asymmetry, the relative difference between the average left and the average right. So here's a snapshot from an upcoming release of IMU-Step showing the new impact asymmetry metric. On the Christmas tree graph, we see the distribution of left and right step impacts for an approximately 20-minute duration session. We can see an average impact intensity on the left of 11.35 G with the black dotted line, and an average impact intensity on the right of 8.47 G with the black dotted line. In the summary section at the top right of the screen, we can see the impact asymmetry calculation. Difference divided by the sum. The difference, 2.88 G divided by the sum, 11.35 G plus 8.47 G, giving us an asymmetry of 14.52% left. Walking through another example here, we see an average impact intensity on the left of 18.31 G this time, and an average impact intensity on the right of 16.94 G, somewhat higher average impact intensities than the previous example. In the summary section at the top right of the screen, again, we see the impact asymmetry calculation. The difference, 1.33 G divided by the sum, giving us an asymmetry of only 3.77% left, significantly smaller than the previous example. Despite the differences between the average impact intensity being 2.88 G on the first example and 1.33 G on the second example, the asymmetry differences were 14.52% and 3.77% respectively. So the fact that the average impact intensity of both left and right steps was considerably smaller in the first example than the second example gave us very different impact asymmetry results. So these examples highlight the importance of considering both the absolute and relative asymmetry measures to increase the context, I guess, around asymmetry results. There may well be some questions on that at the end of the webinar, which I'd be more than happy to jump back into. So this example shows another new feature soon to be released in IMU-Step, the impact asymmetry history section, showing the longitudinal change in impact asymmetry in relation to impact load across time. This section allows us to see that for the selected time frame, this athlete's average impact asymmetry is 5.88% left on the blue dotted line. We can now compare the asymmetry from today's session to the average asymmetry for this athlete over any period of time. So this is important. In my experience, this is what is most useful when using step asymmetry as an injury risk mitigation tool. Many athletes have long-standing asymmetry in their gait. This may be due to significant previous injury, ipsilateral joint mobility differences, congenital skeletal abnormalities such as leg length discrepancies, or simply due to ingrained asymmetrical motor patterns. It's important to know about long-standing asymmetries as they will have an effect on the overall musculoskeletal system as compensatory movement results. However, what's most relevant from a day-to-day standpoint, in my opinion, is being able to know when there has been a change to the way in which that athlete is moving. This is information that can be taken into consideration with other forms of data and physical assessments and acted on with manual treatments or with corrective exercise to mitigate the risk of future injury. My approach to dealing with running asymmetry has been centered around understanding an athlete's baseline symmetry measure, employing corrective exercise to account for that, as well as tracking and reacting to changes in running symmetry in an agile manner day to day. I'll now take you through a rehabilitation period for a player and discuss how IMU-Step influences decision making along the way. So what we'll discuss is how I use this data day to day, what to consider when regarding an athlete's ready to return to play, and what my thought processes are regarding a meaningful change in asymmetry. I'll just attempt to switch to some reports there. James, you able to just tell me that you see the Excel report there now?
Yeah, it's all coming through live, Andrew. It looks good.
Great. So on top of using the IMU-Step dashboard, I've also been exporting summarized results and throwing them into Excel templates. Reason being, just so that I can have a look longitudinally, I can play around with what other metrics I might be able to develop, and it makes it a little bit easier for me to incorporate GPS data as well along the way. So the way that these reports are put together, you can see in the individual reporting tabs here, There's a session report, there's a footnote report, and then there are 2 load versus asymmetry reports. Each of those reports, the session report and footnote report, are laid out in the same format, being volume, intensity, load distribution, and asymmetry. So volume, how much was performed; intensity, at what rate was it performed; load distribution, how was that load distributed, and if we like there, we're thinking about absolute asymmetry. And then the asymmetry tab was how was the average impact asymmetry affected by different drills or different days or different loading patterns. And then if you like, that's the relative asymmetry. Now jumping over to the left-hand side here, specifically down in the footnote area, down here you can see footnote system used. I employed a system with 6 different sections here to enable greater insight from the reports. And those 6 sections were separated by underscores and were titled category, name, intensity, dimensions, surface, and free. So every drill or every portioned activity that we separated within training had some form of name in each of those 6 categories. If there was nothing suitable from that drill to put in that category, simply a Z was put in there, because then it throws it at the bottom of a slicer and makes it easier to slice and dice your data afterwards. So an example down the bottom here was a speed drill named 10-20-10, the intensity of 80% being the prescribed intensity for the athlete. The dimensions was over a 40-meter distance. Surface was grass, which is important because we use our sensors indoor and outdoor, on sand, so on and so forth. And the free field, in this instance, we decided to use the number of repetitions of that activity performed, which is relevant when we're trying to calculate individual reps, load per rep. So James, just let me know if we're not jumping from screen to screen here, because I can switch to some screenshots I've taken. But
we're good, Andrew.
Thanks, mate. What we're looking at here is the session tab for a left foot midfoot surgery. An athlete, professional athlete, having midfoot surgery with a rehabilitation interval of around about 10 to 12 weeks. And you can see in the top left of the screen here, we've got the volume graph up until 2008-11, which is the 11th of August. We can see that most of those sessions, the impact load was lower than 20,000. There are all these movement sessions, indoor sessions, and early rehabilitation activities there that were indoor that we normally wouldn't be capturing with GPS devices. It commences outdoor running training around the 15th of August, this first session here, and then we've captured approximately 10 outdoor running sessions leading into his return to play within the season last year. In the bottom top right, we're seeing the intensity. Just to orientate you with this graph, the orange line is equal to the impact load per minute. So we can see the overall impact load per minute of those movement sessions being significantly lower than the field sessions. We can see a general increase in the intensity per minute of those field sessions, with a spike up here on the 17th of August, which I'll discuss, that has some implications for the next week or so. Then the step intensity distribution, blue being the low intensity steps, orange being the medium intensity steps, and red being the high intensity steps. Once again, all exported straight from the IMU-Step dashboard. Now, what we see on the left-hand side, the left y-axis, is the percentage distribution of those steps, whereas we actually do see the number of steps in each of those categories on the graph here. So there are significantly different numbers of steps in each of those categories during this progression. However, the percentage allows us to see how they're distributed, hence the step intensity distribution. Down the bottom left, a little bit more going on in this graph here. This, reminding everybody, is the absolute asymmetry portion. We're looking at the load distribution. So the black columns is the impact load difference from side to side. Where the black column sits above the x-axis, we're actually seeing more impact load in that session on the right-hand side. Where the black column sits below the line, we're seeing more impact load on the left-hand side. The three lines, the blue, orange, and red line, are the same colors and represent the same categories as the top right graph for low, medium, and high intensity steps. And what we're seeing here is the blue line, for instance, being on the 0 point or the 0% here. We're seeing that the blue line represents that there are the same number of low intensity steps on either side, whereas the rehabilitation progresses. During this portion here, we're seeing a higher percentage of low intensity steps on the left-hand side, being the injured side, and an increasing amount of medium intensity steps in orange on the right-hand side. You can see the fluctuation in distribution of the high intensity steps between the left side and the right side, which I'll explain in a little more detail, and taught us a lot about this athlete and a lot about how we can use the inertial sensors throughout this rehabilitation. On the bottom right, we're simply seeing an average impact asymmetry graph. Left leg in blue, right steps in orange. The measurements here are in G's, and it just gives us an indication of the average step impact throughout the whole rehabilitation protocol. So you can see that a lot of the movement sessions had an average step impact of 3.5 to 4G, a spike here on the 8th. As we started to get out onto the field, we see variation and a gradual increase in the average step intensity throughout those sessions, which I'll explain with the different types of sessions. I've also got some other injuries in through here, which I'm happy to answer some questions about at the end, but for the purpose of this case study portion here, we'll focus mainly on the athlete recovering from the midfoot surgery. Now, first thing to note, maybe the first thing we might investigate on the footnote tab here is on the 17th of August, we see a spike down through here in intensity, in average intensity. So if we jump to the footnote tab, you're still seeing that change there, James?
Yep, still good.
Great. So over here now we're seeing the same graphs, volume, intensity, load distribution, and asymmetry, but now we're looking at individual footnotes. Just to orientate you there, the x-axis now is additional information, the number of the drills, so this is the number or the order that drill occurred throughout the session. The category, if you remember from the footnoting system, this is the category, drill 1 being a warm-up activity, drills 2 to 5 being multi-directional activities, a stride activity thrown in there, 3 more multi-directional activities, then 3 stride activities to finish the session. We're seeing the impact load in blue, seeing the duration of those up here, so almost like just a running report of what occurred that day. Now, interestingly, looking at the fluctuation here of where the high intensity steps are occurring, this was the first time during this rehabilitation that we did start to notice this. Remembering that this athlete is recovering from left midfoot surgery. Someone recovering from left midfoot surgery, as the intensity of activity increases, we can see the intensity of the average step intensity on the bottom right increasing throughout this session. We would intuitively expect that more of the high intensity steps would occur on the uninjured side. You know, athletes tend to nurse their way back from an injury when they're not as confident, when there's some weakness in and around the foot, there may still be some pain there, some joint mobility restriction. But interestingly, in the last 3 drills, we noticed that, especially in the last 2 drills, which were stride activities, the high intensity steps were actually occurring more on the injured side than the uninjured side. You can see that down through here as the average step intensity of those 2 drills went up over the 15G mark. He was putting more of the load onto his injured side than his uninjured side. Obviously not ideal, still a few weeks away from returning to sport, and has some implications as we go on. If we jump through to the next day, this is 2 days later, we don't see a return to that kind of pattern, but interestingly, we didn't do any stride activity in that session. It was mainly a multi-directional session, just being the planned periodization for his rehabilitation. We jump forward 2 more days, and once again, has a couple of stride activities in here, drills 7 and 8, some speed activities early on, and in both of those stride activities, we see the same pattern where the loading actually increases and he has more of the high intensity steps on his injured side. But remembering back to the 17th, those stride activities were up around 15G or above. On the 21st, the two stride activities, drill 7 and drill 8, 12 and 13, and then much lower. So not as intense an activity. As we jump through the rest of those, we're starting to ask some questions about why this athlete actually changes his symmetry to increasing the amount of high intensity steps on his injured side. And interestingly, this athlete has previous hip problems on the other side, and his other hip range of motion is significantly reduced. If we think about multi-directional activity and the movement of multi-directional activity, the hip ranges of motion aren't as extreme with change of direction drills, but as soon as somebody starts getting in a taller posture, having a longer stride length, that obviously increases the amount of movement in the hip joint, both in flexion and extension, and that's where this athlete is quite restricted. So, intuitively with a midfoot problem, we would think that stride running, running 50-meter segments, 100-meter segments, laps of a field, would be relatively innocuous for a midfoot problem and something that somebody could do a fair bit more of early on compared to change of direction activity or a hard acceleration activity. Whereas we were actually finding that that's what was giving this athlete the most trouble. Now, the reason that's interesting is because that made us shift the focus of this rehabilitation program away from stride activity. We were finding that he was pulling up sorer from the type of drills that we would expect him to find easier, and it was more due to restriction in his opposite hip rather than the injured foot, which is just a reminder that when we're rehabilitating somebody, it's the whole system that we're rehabilitating, not just that left foot. It was actually the opposite hip that was having more of an effect. So if I jump through to the last day here on the footnote, we're now looking at the 26th of August. You can see that we've made a decision by this point to move the conditioning or open running, stride running, to the end of his session rather than having it earlier on in his session. And we tend to see an improvement in the way that he handles that session from a symmetry point of view. I'm sure there's going to be some questions about that, which I'll leave enough time for us to jump into. So if I skip through these reports, moving on to something here, which is the impact load graphed against the average impact asymmetry by session for the same athlete. Now, if I clear this graph here, we're looking at all of the sessions that this athlete had recorded, and to remind everybody that he started on the field on the 15th of August. All of these sessions down here on the bottom left of the screen from the 28th of July to the 11th of August involve indoor sessions involving various basic movements, walking, skipping, light hopping, plyometric activities, more preparing to run activities, moving to the grass on the 15th. So if I remove those early sessions, so we're really just looking at him on the grass. Now, looking at the orange line here is his average impact asymmetry. So we're not looking at the absolute asymmetry, we're looking at the relative asymmetry, not the amount of total load between each leg, the average left step compared to the average right step in the entire session for each of those days. Now, what we would expect to see, more load on the right-hand side early on, hopefully with a normalization of that load towards better symmetry as this athlete recovers. Now, because of ADI, having recorded symmetry from a thoracic mounted inertial sensor for many years, and not having any hard science around exactly what is a significant amount of asymmetry, the way that I've approached this in the past is, we've recorded, imagine a pool of 30 players and recording asymmetry day to day. We find that not all players are symmetrical. Some are quite symmetrical. Some players have a chronic asymmetry of 3% right. Others have a chronic asymmetry of 2% left. As discussed before, these things are due to previous injury, joint mobility issues, leg length discrepancies, weaknesses, or just habitual gait patterns. So we tend to look at those chronic asymmetries and treat the larger ones of those with corrective exercise to try and improve the resilience of athletes, because intuitively somebody running with an asymmetrical gait is going to be more prone to issues than someone running with a symmetrical gait. The decision around how much asymmetry is significant. Now, I've got a dirty science way that we deal with new technology. And if I look at the distribution of a group of elite athletes, say 30, 40 athletes, at any one time, we don't want to set a threshold in an area where 75% of them are highlighting. We may want to set that threshold. We don't also want to set that threshold where only 5% of athletes are highlighting. If we want to understand a measure and understand a system, I tend to work around a 20 to 25%. So I guide the threshold of that asymmetry or that measure such that roughly 20 to 25% of athletes are highlighting. Then we can investigate those athletes more closely and search for relevance. So over the years of using asymmetry in thoracic mounted sensors, that has tended to be somewhere in the order of 2 to 2.5%. So 2 to 2.5% chronic asymmetry appears to be what's significant. The majority of those athletes have joint mobility issues, previous injuries, weaknesses, so on and so forth. Now, what's relevant for me, as I mentioned before, is the day-to-day change in asymmetry. Interestingly, if we look at day-to-day change, if we screen 30 athletes from thoracic mounted sensors and pick up approximately 2% asymmetry change from their periodic average might be over 6 weeks, approximately somewhere between 10 to 30% of athletes will highlight on any given day and as having changed to their baseline asymmetry. Interestingly, early in a week post-game, we tend to find that number is closer to 30%. As players recover throughout the week, go through further training, corrective exercise, treatment, massage, recovery, we tend to find that the number of players deviating more than 2% from their chronic asymmetry reduces down to 10% or below. So that level with thoracic mounted sensors has seemed to be around 2%. Once again, nothing that's been proven with research. It's anecdotal from my experience at this point. Now, having also tracked athletes with thoracic mounted sensors and ankle mounted inertial sensors concurrently, I can make comparisons between certain measures or also between the asymmetry of a certain athlete. What we have found there is that the ankle mounted asymmetry tends to be in the order of 2 to 3 times greater than the thoracic mounted asymmetry. So putting all of that together, once again, happy to answer some questions on this. We have started, we've begun with an initial marker of 5% ankle mounted asymmetry using IMU-Step as being a level that begins to be significant. When we have players with greater than 5% chronic asymmetry, we intervene with corrective exercise. When we have deviations of greater than 5% from chronic asymmetry on a day-to-day basis, we look for reasons why. Was it the drill selection? Was it symptoms that the players had? Have there been changes in joint mobility? Is there pain? Is there restriction? What can we deal with on a day-to-day basis that might help mitigate the risk of injury? So jumping back to the graph here, using that 5% threshold, we can see that early on, this player is within those limits. And that was also in line with his chronic thoracic mounted symmetry that we had seen pre-surgery. At this point, the athlete wasn't really under too much stress. Impact load sessions of 15,000, 30,000, 40,000, 40,000, 40,000. Now, interestingly, on the 21st, we started to see a larger asymmetry, and on the 24th, an even larger asymmetry as the load increased. Then the reduction down to more of a normalized level here, which I'll discuss a little further. So if you recall, the multi-directional drills here was coping with a little better. The stride running and open running drills, the opposite hip was starting to have more of an effect. The insight came when we split his drills this way, which would not have been possible without the footnoting structure. So what we're looking at here is the different drill categories over the entire rehabilitation protocol for this athlete, so about 10 sessions, all of his conditioning drills in the bottom left, all of his stride running drills with the longest stride length, when he was back with the team doing skill drills, his warm-up activities, his speed drills, drilling activities, skips and marches and double contacts, all of his multi-directional movement, his plyometric activity, and then his acceleration drills. Now, interestingly, we can compare, because of the footnoting structure, the asymmetry of each of those categories of drills. And at this point, it becomes obvious that this athlete has the most issue from his injured side with his acceleration activities, plyometric activities, and multi-directional movements, which, when you think about it, for a midfoot problem, is when that player is forefoot loading. Multi-directional activities is not only forefoot loading, he's also first ray loading, which is going to put a lot of torsional stress through his midfoot. So intuitively, that makes sense that they would be the hardest activities for him to do and the ones that he would offload the most during. When we see down here, you can clearly see the pattern of what we were finding early on when we pushed this athlete really hard from a conditioning standpoint. When he did stride activities, he actually put more load onto his left side, being the injured side. So at this point, we made a conscious effort to make sure that we weren't overdoing the stride running and the long stride length activities, as they were putting more load onto his injured side. We made sure we were getting enough of that done to get him prepared for coming back to training. But normally in this rehabilitation, we may have controlled the amount of multi-directional activity rather than the stride running activity. We would have done more of that. So being able to footnote in this way and splitting up the activity into movement categories was what gave us the additional insight there. Now, if I switch back here, I think at this point, James, it might be best to jump to some questions about any of the graphs, and I can run through the Excel reports in more detail.
Cool, yeah, I've got a few lined up. The first one is going to be from Adriana. She asks, if an athlete is at an elite level, wouldn't it be difficult to remove asymmetries that are present at the baseline?
Definitely, Adriana, definitely difficult. The way we look at that is we're never going to be able to remove asymmetries of all of our athletes, but we want to be able to make them more resilient to that asymmetry. For instance, somebody with an arthritic knee that may have lost a few degrees of extension and affects the way that that athlete moves, may have, in our experience, an asymmetry in the order of 3, 4, 5%, even from a thoracic mounted sensor, which would be greater from an ankle mounted sensor for a long period of time. Now, having an asymmetry like that, I've seen players have that for 10 to 15 years, still have long, successful careers, and be quite resilient to injury. During that time, what we have done though, if we know that during all activity there is 4 to 5% more load going through the opposite side, we want to make sure that we are looking after the tendons and the soft tissue and joint mobility of that other side to account for that asymmetry. Hope that makes sense.
Yep, thanks, Andrew. This is a question from Juan. He asks, which asymmetry variable is more sensible to detect a possible injury? And which percent of asymmetry can be considered as normal?
Okay, great question. The first question, which asymmetry measure, either the absolute or the relative? I don't think there's not a black and white answer there. The answer is both, and it's dependent on the context. Just as a reminder, the absolute asymmetry, or the total amount of impact load going through each side, tells us, I guess, the cause, that session being the cause, how much load has gone through each side. The relative asymmetry may consider as being the effect. Has the absolute difference in the amount of load that's gone through each side had an effect that is causing that athlete to have a different average step through each side? Ideally, in a rehabilitation session, we want to normalize both of those measures to the best of our ability, understanding the limitations of that athlete. There are some things that we're not going to change. If there's arthritic change to an ankle and there's a severe loss of range of motion in one ankle compared to the other, you're going to see an asymmetry, and there's no way we're going to be able to correct for that. So I guess to answer that question, they're both important. Now, the absolute amount that's important, we don't know. But from my experience, those percentages that I was talking about, somewhere in the order of 5% with ankle-mounted sensors, somewhere in the order of 2% with thoracic-mounted sensors, tends to be significant for our population in our environment. That will have approximately 20 to 25% of the group having issues there, correlates well with injuries that have occurred, correlates well with symptoms. What's relevant is the day-to-day change. Once you know that day-to-day change, you can look into why that's occurred, seeing if it's something that you can change with your planning, also seeing if there's some things that can be done with manual treatment, with the physio department, with corrective exercise and mobility. So it's almost like a change in asymmetry is really just a sign that something has changed. When that something has changed, then it's up to us to use that piece of information to see if we can bring relevance to that change to protect that athlete and mitigate the risk of injury.
Yeah, Andrew, I think that point's probably worth clarifying. When you say you use 5% as a trigger to look at the athlete in more detail, is that 5% just of what their impact asymmetry is, or is that a 5% change in what that specific athlete's baseline is?
That's a 5% change in the impact asymmetry, the average left versus the average right step, from their chronic baseline. If they have, example there, if they have a chronic baseline of 2% left, a significant change for us in our environment would be that 2% left either going greater than 7% left or going greater than 3% right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's just good to clarify. That kind of goes back to Adriana's question, where you're not using 5% exactly when you're talking about just the impact asymmetry. It's finding a good baseline for these athletes and then 5% away from their baseline, because you may have people who don't have they have a functional asymmetry, and you're not really ever going to get them to perfectly symmetrical.
Correct.
Okay, so this question is for Jay. He asks, what is the rationale for calculating asymmetry by dividing the difference by the total instead of the average?
That's probably one for IMU to answer. Let me have a go at that. Rationale of using the difference divided by the total rather than the difference divided by the average. Example being the example I used with 11 and 9. So if we have 11 on the left, 9 on the right, that gives us a difference of 2. If we have 11 on the left, 9 on the right, that gives us a total of 20. We're saying that that is a 10% asymmetry. 2 divided by 20, that's 10% to the left, and that would be 10% from symmetry. Yeah, I don't think I've answered that very well. Sorry, Jay.
Hey Jay, just so everyone knows, that asymmetry metric is actually a sneak peek. So we're looking to release impact asymmetry next week, and we'll have a bunch of documentation alongside of that. So if you need kind of a more detailed answer, that should all be coming in the coming weeks. Andrew, probably got time for one more. This one is in relation to that case study you're showing. This is from Adriana again. She says, when outside, did that athlete do any of the same movements he did indoors? And if we could take a look at kind of how that looked.
No, not really, Adriana, not really at all. But no, we did all of our plyometric activities indoor. We didn't do any of the running activities indoor. As soon as he transitioned to the field, the type of those activities did significantly change. So no, unfortunately not. But we have looked at the same drills outdoor from early to late in the process, and basically, been able to show that as the prescribed intensity of that activity increased. I can probably quickly show you one of those there. If we jump to all days, you're seeing that screen change there again, James?
Yep.
So there are all of the drills on all of the days for that athlete. If we basically say we're just going to look at just the multi-directional drills for that athlete, we might just look at one particular drill carried out throughout that activity on different days. If I expand these down through here, we can see the change in dimensions or number of meters, the size of those boxes, the prescribed intensity from low to medium to high being the same drill, and we can see that the impact intensity of those drills gradually increases. It was quite asymmetrical on that day. If we look at the J drills here, we can see as the intensity of those drills increased, we can compare that drill day to day. The reason of doing that kind of thing there was so that we also have the impact load up here in grey in the top right per repetition, so that we can see on each of one of those days the impact load per repetition of this drill, 220. As the drill goes to a high intensity, the impact load per repetition, 360. This cut drill up through here over the bigger spaces, up around 500. The reason we decided to do that was we'd like to build this system into a session builder, where we can actually go and prescribe a session, count the number of repetitions we're going to do of each drill, and get an idea of what the load should be like for that session, and be proactive to see whether that's actually going to fit into the planning for that athlete along the way. Because using IMU-Step for this type of rehabilitation exposed a few problems in our rehab process, to be honest, where we had some days that there were significant jumps that caused a few problems. We learnt about the difference between the stride running and multi-directional activity for this athlete, all things that we wouldn't have found out without the ankle-mounted sensors.
Great, Andrew. And then last question from Anonymous. How have you used the IMU-Step and surface type in your rehab progression?
More to understand the impact load per step, impact peak per step of sprint running, high intensity change of direction, stride running on grass in a baselining standpoint. So once we've got an idea of how an athlete hits the ground in each of those activities, then when an injury occurs, we can start with low impact activity indoor and be confident that we are having a nice smooth progression of the impact intensity for that athlete with hopping movements, plyometric activities, drilling movements, jumps and lands. So it's really just using the baseline activities to give us an idea of how that athlete usually performs. Then we're not guessing with our rehab activity early on. We're less likely to make mistakes as we go along.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I think I'll probably cut it off there. We're a little bit over our time already. So, Andrew, thanks a ton for your time on this webinar. Thanks everyone who attended. Just a reminder, you guys will be sent the recording after this webinar processes, so probably sometime tomorrow. Make sure you join us next week for our webinar. You'll be directed to sign up for that as soon as you close this window, so hopefully that's easy for you. And then everyone have a happy holidays if we don't talk before then. Andrew, is there any contact info you want to share if people want to get in touch, or should they just go through us?
Yeah, probably best just to go through you, James. More than happy for anyone to reach out if there's any further questions. Thanks a lot for joining, everyone.
All right, thanks everyone.